staying. Last but least but not last, we have, you can hear me? No? You good? We have Jeffrey from Rare Skills. Actually, Jeffrey is has an interesting career and also interesting ideas of this space. We had earlier, I think, people mentioned that the material by Rare Skill is one of the best in this space about smart contract, about zero knowledge, about Solana, about many things. And you had questions about zero knowledge. So now it's your stuff. You're going to get 1 hour condensed about zero knowledge. Take it.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you for having me here and giving me an opportunity to talk about a subject I'm very interested in. Okay, so let me just get like a background pulse over here. Who here has maybe written some code that directly implements ZK, like with CIRCOM or written a prover or something? Yes. Okay. All right. And who's participated in like an audit contest that use this stuff? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so for some of you this may be new. For others of you, maybe not. But what the title is "How to Get into ZK Auditing," but it's more just about how to navigate. First of all, how does it work? If for those of you who are new to it, and second of all, what subfields are there and how do they relate to each other? Okay, so what is ZK? I'm going to go off the beaten path a little bit and give this definition. People say it's an algorithm for proving that you know something. Well, that's not. I don't think that's a helpful definition because I know of a certain color that I'm thinking about. But there's no way that I can turn that thought process into code. We need to have something concrete that we're proving knowledge of. And what actually happens in practice is ZK is about trying to prove that you have a solution to a system of equations, something like this. I want to convince you that I know the X, Y, Z, and U that are going to make this equation pass. Okay, that's really all it is. Nothing more, nothing less. Of course, one way to prove that you know a solution to a system of equations is just to plug the answers in. Right? I'm going to give you X, Y, Z, and U. Now, you know the answer, you can run the computation, and yeah, clearly I know the answer to the system of equations, but that's not very interesting because if the equation is massive, which it usually will be, think like millions of lines, it's going to take you a long time to do that. So if you are somehow able to prove that you know the answer to a system of equations using a lot less amount of data than the amount of variables there are, then we would say that's succinct. If the information I give you doesn't tell you anything about what the correct answer is, right, then we would say it's zero knowledge. Now, maybe if I'm giving you something that's succinct, then clearly I'm not, there's some information would seemingly have to have been removed. So you might say, well, if I give you a lot less than the amount of variables, doesn't that already hide information? Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe the proof that I'm giving you is giving you some statistical information. Well, I can kind of guess that U is 0 based off of what you told me, or at least there's an 80% chance that U is 0. In that case, it's not considered zero knowledge. So in terms of security and ZK and all that matters is, can I convince you that I know the answer to this? Can I do it with a lot fewer than 4 variables or whatever the amount of variables are? And can I do it securely? Securely, I'll actually talk about the attack vectors later, but we can think about, like, we don't want to leak the answer or things like that. Okay, now, when we look at an equation like this, that's like, all right, that's cool, but that looks like something I would do in my algebra homework. How do we do anything useful with this? The whole point is that we want to encode these systems of equations in a way that express something semantically interesting. So for example, I could say, hey, this is a polynomial with roots at, who wants to tell me what are the roots? 1 and 0, very good. So this is a polynomial with roots at 1 and 0 written in programmer equality form. All right, so that's one way of saying it. This is a polynomial with roots 1 and 0, but you could also think of it as, well, this is a statement that x has the value 0 or 1. Okay? So, all right, that's moderately interesting, right? That's the foundation of all modern computers. This one is saying, well, x is either 1, 2, or 3, right? Because those are the only numbers that you can plug into this formula such that the constraint is true. So that's one way of saying it. I could also say, hey, x is an element in a set which contains 1, 2, 3. That's another way of saying it. All right? This is saying that x is 1, 2, or 3, and y is 1, 2, or 3. Right? So it could be the case that x is 2 and y is 3. But it couldn't be the case that x is 2 and y is 5. Right? So we're saying that these are the range of values. Now we could stretch this out. This wouldn't be the best way to do it, but we could stretch this out from 1 to 21 and say, hey, my age is below the drinking age or something like that, right? Okay, let's build this up a little bit. Here we're saying x has the value 1, 2, or 3, and y has the value 1, 2, or 3, and x and y have the same value. So what's another way of saying this? Anyone want to take a stab at it? There's a lot of correct answers. Yeah, that would be true. Well, what you could say is, well, x and y have the same value. So there's 3 possibilities. X and y are 1, x and y are 2, or x and y are 3. We don't know which of them is true necessarily, but we know at least one of those 3 statements is true. Okay, what would be an equation that says, I have x, y, and z. One of them is 0. I don't necessarily know what the other values are. I just know that one of them is 0, at least one. Anyone know how we would express that? X by x times 1? Okay, you're on the right track. How would we include y in that? Yes, that's right. Very good. What's your name? Thank you. Okay, so x times y times z is equal to 0. This says that one of these is 0 valued. Now, y could be 5 and z could be 1, 3, 3, 7, right? It could be one of those things, but we know at least one of them is 0. Or at least it could be x, y, and z are both 0, or all 3 0, or whatever. All right, anyone want to challenge? How would you express this? X is equal, u is equal to x, or u is equal to y, or u is equal to z. Very good. You guys see how that works? So if u is equal to any of these values, then you have a term which becomes 0 and the whole thing multiplies to 0. Now we can say something even more interesting in English, which is u is in the list x, y, z. You can see how I can, what makes ZK a little bit weird at first is I can have these formulas, but with the right framing, I can say something that's useful in English, which is still mathematically enforced. So now we have a statement about membership in a vector. All right, let's build off of that. I'm going to say u is an element of the vector that contains x, y, and z, and v is an element of the vector that is x, y, and z. How would I express this? It's even simpler than that. That won't quite work because if the two left sides are not 0, you could find values that make them, you could have like 5 equals 5, then that wouldn't force it to be the case. Okay, so I'll just give you guys the answer. The reason why I said it simply, you don't even need to add anything. If both constraints are true, then that gives you an implicit and, right? Okay. There's more composable ways to express a Boolean and, but this is not a class. This is a talk. All right. You can read the ZK book. Anyway, let's do this one. Right? This is not, we haven't taken too many far steps from what we've already covered, don't worry. So what we're saying, TUV is a permutation of XYZ, right? So if the first list is 5, 10, 15, then 15, 10, 5 is, that's an accepted thing, but there can't be any, if an element's in one list, it needs to be in the other. Okay. Would this adequately express it? I know the question at the bottom kind of suggests it's not secure, but let's see if anyone can figure out why. Oh, okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, for the permutation, they need to be distinct.
Uh-huh.
So here you don't guarantee that they're distinct. They can be the same.
Very good. Nailed it. So if the first list contains the same value over and over again, then you could just satisfy one of the terms. So what you really need to do to prove a permutation is you need to have, it needs to go both ways. Now this is not how we prove permutations in practice because the number of constraints grows quadratically with the number of elements in the list, which is O of n squared is usually a bad thing, right? So there's actually very clever ways to do this in a more efficient way, but again, it would take me too long to get to that point to tell you. I'm just letting you know. But for our purposes, we can prove permutations using this system of equations. Make sense? Because I'm not done yet. This is where I'm about to do something more complicated. All right. Now that we know how to do permutations, we can prove we know the solution to a Sudoku puzzle. Right? Because if you have, I'm not going to show a 9 by 9 because it's massive. But here we're going to do a 4 by 4. Each row and column is a permutation of 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? And each of the sub boxes is a permutation of 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you create the permutation constraints for each row, column, and sub box against the vector 1, 2, 3, 4, then you can prove you have the solution to a Sudoku puzzle. This is not like, because the permutation that we're showing here, is this the best way to prove that you know the solution to a Sudoku puzzle? No, actually, since we're dealing with a very small subset of numbers, another thing you could do is say, hey, I'm going to map each of the numbers 1 to 9 to a prime number, and then multiply them all together. And because of how prime numbers work, there's only one product that can happen if they're unique. So that's a cool solution, but that only works if you're dealing with a small number of numbers because you have to remap each one. So there's several ways that you can go about this. That's when you guys have probably seen on Twitter, there's a lot of fast progress with ZK VMs, right? A lot of it comes down to like, hey, this is what I'm trying to express, and here's the math I use to express it. But wait a minute. If I rethink my math a little bit, I can actually use a lot less constraints to express the same thing. That's where a lot of the advancements are happening. Okay. This one I won't answer. But there's a constraint here that says each variable is from the members of 1, 2, 4. The cell or row is a permutation of 0. Oh, sorry. This constraint over here says that the cell is 1, 2, 3, or 4. Then we have row constraints, column constraints, row permutations, column permutations, and box permutations. So the question then becomes: are any of these constraints redundant with each other? Actually, you can take a picture of it and think about it on your own. I'm not going to get into that, but figuring out if a constraint is redundant or not is a source of optimization or bugs. Because if you remove a constraint, then you can prove the wrong constraint. You can prove you know the solution to a Sudoku puzzle when in fact you don't. Okay. Oh, sorry. I'll let you guys take the picture of that. Cool. So what we just did was a bit mathematical, a bit philosophical, right? Which is kind of what makes ZK fun. And this is where all of the security questions come in. So me doing all of these permutation constraints was kind of my way of presenting Sudoku. But did that actually capture, if Sudoku is relatively simple, but for a more complex problem, does that actually capture what I'm trying to do? Or is it just incidental? Right here, we're just showing, hey, these are the math equations that I need to write, but this sits inside of a larger piece of infrastructure where you're transmitting data from one place to another. Is the size of your data transmission leaking something, right? Or the usable side channel things going on. Right, we haven't shown how we go from a system of equations and a solution to something that is a compressed version of the system of equations and a solution. Is that transformation process secure? I'll talk about that a little bit, but that's another area where things can break. All right. Now, for those of you who are curious, thinking about getting into auditing, I'll just share my perspective, having trained some people who actually completed the journey. That's going to inform a lot of the rest of this talk. If you watched this last part and thought that was fun and thought maybe I want to get into this, I'll just kind of speak to that. Everyone who I've seen by saying become a ZK auditor, I mean they got hired by a firm. So that's kind of I think a validation that they got to a certain point, right? But obviously some of them went on to be successful contest people. I'm not counting that. I'm just talking about the people who went on to firms here. Everyone who got hired by a firm as a ZK person had one of these two things. They already had a good math background, and I'll talk more about what I mean by good math background because there's a lot of misconception around that. Or they already were good at auditing Solidity or some Web 2 thing or some more traditional area of security. Because the attacker's mindset, I've seen people if they have a very, very good attacker's mindset, once they know the bare minimum of how ZK works, they can start actually doing productive things in security right away. I've seen that happen as fast as a week if they were trained very effectively. So, but you need one of these two things. You know, if it doesn't apply to you, then, you know, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. You have a longer journey ahead. Okay, so to really get ZK, you can study ZK directly, but it does require some background knowledge, as I was just hinting at. Let's talk about exactly what that is. And the other thing I want to say, it might look like I'm just dumping a lot of material on you and I'm giving you a roadmap or something like that. If you want to be successful in any field, you know, you don't really want to think about it as, hey, I take these steps, I get a certain goal, and then yay, life is happy after that. It doesn't work that way, right? You have to constantly be staying ahead of the curve and constantly improving yourself even after you've accomplished some goal, which may be like, oh, I want certain contest earnings or work at a firm or something like that. So what I'm presenting here is more about, hey, these are the things I think you should block off 30 minutes a day to studying. Now, the order in which you do it may vary, but these are the areas that are worth the investment that you'll actually see ROI in. Okay, so the things that are not related to ZK, I'll talk about ZK in the part after this. But these are all the most common things that I see in ZK that are not directly ZK itself. Math background, obviously, again, I will explain what I mean by strong math background because that does not mean you need to go off and get a math major. Proficient in Rust, everybody in ZK seems to be Rust-pilled, so you should know it, not that hard. Cryptography algorithms, like hash functions and public signatures. In privacy applications, it's very common to do ZK for that. Like, I want to prove to you that I know the private key for a certain wallet without writing a signature because then that's going to connect me to the wallet. So you want to know how those work. And I'll talk about the degree to which it's helpful to know it because obviously you don't need to be an expert in cryptography, but you do need to know some things. MIPS and RISC-V are the most common architectures I see. And these are pretty darn simple. They're even simpler than the EVM. So I'll talk about how you can learn them, but I'm just giving you an overview. All right, let's talk about math where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time. Algebra is the number one thing. Like we were just doing algebra, right? So you need to be very fast when it comes to recognizing, oh, this is a solution to a system of equations. If you're slowed down there, it's kind of like running with metal shoes, right? So you definitely want to make sure that you're okay with algebra. Now, after that, there isn't any like one field that gets heavily used. I mean, abstract algebra is a very common language for expressing concepts inside of ZK, but I've seen a lot of people do just fine without. They probably know less abstract algebra than a typical undergraduate math major would, right? The thing, though, you do want to understand abstract algebra, and to get there, jumping straight from algebra to abstract algebra is a little rough. So it is helpful to have at least some familiarity with these intermediate subjects where I've put a star next to. Okay, now completing this math, now I think in a perfect world, you actually study all of these subjects properly, and you study abstract algebra properly, and this would not take that long. Like algebra can be learned in half a year, and same thing for proof writing, discrete math, and linear algebra. So even if you're moving quite slowly, that would probably be like 2.5 years to complete all of this, assuming like you're moving at a slow pace. But my point is, you don't need to wait 2.5 years to start doing ZK stuff. But I think this is all stuff that you want to learn eventually and want to be making progress towards. Especially if you want to get to the frontier of the field and you want to read papers, you do need to be fluent in abstract algebra because that's the language that they use. These are nice things and absolutely not necessary. There's some stuff on here that I'm very weak at. But when I've read papers and reasoned through things, I'm like, oh, I wish I knew that a little better. But like I said, think in terms of lifestyle, not roadmap. If you look at all these math things like, oh man, look at this. This is almost like half of an undergraduate major. If you think on the scale of like 5-10 years, this is nothing, right? So just make a little bit of progress. These are the helpful fields, and don't be in a hurry. So there's a lot of, but on the other hand, I don't want to push it in the other direction. Where it's like, oh, you don't have to be that good at math. Sorry, you do have to be kind of good at math. Some people try to be nice, like, oh, I don't want to be elitist. Like, oh, you have to learn math just like me. You have to be like me, smart and disciplined. Like, okay, I don't want to come off like that, right? But you will just end up spinning your wheels unless you're fluent, especially at algebra. And if you want to engage with the modern literature, you need to be familiar with some abstract algebra. Okay. But I'm not also at the same time, there are some people who make ZK seem way more mathematical than it actually is. And it's kind of a problem with academia writers where they like to make, the more complex I make it look, the smarter I look. So I'm going to complexity max this paper. And I, like any normal person, I find that to be quite frustrating. So, I'm not saying that's a good thing. There's a middle ground, but it tends toward having math fluency. And this is what I mean by good at math. When people hear good at math, they think like, oh, it's a person who knows all this stuff on the left column. No. You don't need to know that stuff on the left column, and very few people know all of them. But the stuff on the right is, I'd say this is the core stuff, and anything on top of that is helpful, but at that point you're probably getting diminishing returns. Let me just emphasize with the linear algebra thing, this is more as a stepping stone towards abstract algebra, at least being comfortable with using matrix arithmetic, because you do need to be comfortable with matrix arithmetic. A lot of things are expressed that way. But do you need to know how to do spectral decomposition and eigenvectors? I don't really think so. But you do need to have the elementary parts down. All right. So how do we go about it? Because like I said, there's two one wrong camp is, you don't need to learn math. I'm just going to give you an intuitive explanation with nice animations that tells you what's going on. I think at the end of the day, that's a waste of time because you're not going to be able to do anything productive with that kind of knowledge. On the other hand, I certainly don't think that you need to spend 2.5 years mastering these 5 subjects I talked before you can start doing anything. The way the ZK book works, and honestly pretty much every teaching we do, is in order to understand this subject, what's the bare minimum number of prerequisites to get from high school algebra, which is where we assume everyone starts, up until understanding that point? Now, in a perfect world, you have a very broad understanding leading up to that point, so this becomes easy to learn, but it's not a perfect world. So we spend a lot of our time thinking about, well, in order to understand a pairing, right? Well, there's a lot that could go into understanding a pairing in elliptic curves, but all we really need to think about is the group properties, because that's all that you're actually going to use in practice. If you want to peek under the hood, well, you can study the relevant math for that. But we still have to give people a lens to look at it through a group perspective, otherwise they won't be able to make sense out of it. Okay, but that's talking to rare skills. Again, if you want to engage with the papers and whatnot, they're not going to spend all of their time trying to figure out what's the most prerequisite light way that I can think about this without oversimplifying. They just don't have time to do that. It takes us a lot of time to write like that. Okay, so that's the math thing. Like I said, you don't have to learn all of the math first, but you do need to be making steady progress towards it. Rust is not hard. It's a cool language. I'm going to shill my platform over here, which gives you 700 problems to practice on. If you finish that, you have more than enough Rust. I think 30 days of regular study with Rust, you know most of what you need to know. Because the hard parts about Rust, like the asynchronous and multi-threading stuff, doesn't pop up too frequently. People just more like Rust for the safety features and the really cool type system. And that part's not difficult to learn. So, but just when you're learning Rust, don't just like read books and watch video or something like that. You actually need to write Rust if you want to learn Rust. And if you're here, you're probably quite smart, which means that your brain is good at tricking you into thinking you're learning when you're not. So, okay, I need to actually write Rust. I need to do the actual practice. So your brain thinks like, oh, this is going to expend a lot of valuable energy. How can we get this guy to conserve energy? Because the survival instinct kicks in. Let's just have him watch some YouTube videos or read some tutorials or something like that. Yeah, you should do that. Now I'm going to give you some dopamine so you feel good about yourself, so that you keep not actually doing the hard thing. No, you need to be aware that that's a thing. Your brain is very good at tricking you into doing pseudo-productive things. You can learn it in 30 days. This is not like math where it's a long journey. You can learn Rust in 30 days or 90 days if you're very inconsistent. At least Rust to the degree that you need to know it. Because like I said, almost every major framework in the space uses it. Now cryptography, how much cryptography do you need to learn? I think if you take the equivalent of cryptography 1, which is what most universities would call it, that's plenty. It's worth having implemented the algorithms yourself one time so that you really know what's going on. And then past that, I mean, unless you really want to get into something like FHE or MPC or one of these other buzzword things, just knowing the basics, like how does a public signature work, how does a hash function work, that's more than enough. because in ZK, like how do private blockchains stay private? They actually use encryption, right? How does it work? You say I transmitted money to somebody else, but I encrypt that because I don't want people to know that. And I do a ZK proof that says I encrypted money that I actually have. So you'll need to know how the cryptography algorithm works, but these are pretty rudimentary cryptography algorithms. So how long does it take to study the amount of cryptography needed? I mean, a quarter in a university is about 10 weeks. So I would say with the equivalent amount of work, you can know everything that you need to know, unless you're going into some specialized field that requires some additional cryptography. The more math you already know, the easier cryptography will be to learn. But obviously, the later that you learn cryptography, the later that you will be able to more deeply engage with some cool stuff. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. So I would say with Rust, it can be learned fast. So just most of you guys probably already know it anyway. So just knock that out. But with cryptography, you have to be a little slow and you have to pace it with where you are in your math journey. Also, again, my usual bold text at the bottom. Just watching a video about cryptography will only get you so far. You actually want to implement the algorithm. And they're not as complicated as they look. They're very hard to debug because if you mess something up, it's very hard to tell where you went wrong. But that's a good skill to have. You learn how to build things very incrementally. Okay. Virtual machines. Also something that's simple because MIPS and RISC-V are very simple. I've seen researchers on my team when we had to write about like register-based architectures, they learned this in like a week. Now, it was a week of full-time doing it, but like they actually coded a RISC-V virtual machine from scratch. It's simpler than the EVM. This is not difficult. You just want to know how it works, and if you're going to do the audits, obviously you need some awareness of the specs and how the specs might deviate a little bit. So don't overthink this one. There's a good chance some of you already know it, but if not, don't worry. It does not take a long time to learn it. Okay, so the Rust and VM stuff, simple. They're used widely in ZK, but they're easy to learn. I'm assuming you guys are relatively mature programmers, so these are a time scale that I feel comfortable estimating. Math and cryptography, that requires a little bit more pacing, but once you learn it, it's really going to help you for the rest of your life. And ZK is a field of math technically, so you do need to know it. But don't fall into the extremes where, hey, I just want to jump into ZK without learning math at all, versus, oh, I need to master math completely before I get into ZK. I think both of those extremes are probably not going to work for most people. Okay, so having that out of the way, you do this, you knock out Rust, you knock out VMs, you have a schedule for working your way through math as time goes by. Now let's talk about what you would actually be learning directly related to ZK. Because obviously if you know these 4 subjects now, this doesn't mean you know anything about ZK. Okay, now ZK is a big field and there's no one person who knows everything about it. So what I'm going to be presenting here are areas that you could focus on, and I don't think any one person has it all down. So obviously start here. My biased suggestion is to read the free book that I published on this link. Also Joao, it's one of the authors too back there, so you can thank him. All right. These are the major topics within ZK that pop up. I'll just explain what they are one by one. So arithmetization scheme, arithmetization is just a fancy way of saying writing a system of equations, like what we were doing earlier. Oh, I wanted to say that U is in the list X, Y, Z, so I'll just write it out like this. Now, of course, you don't actually literally write the math. It has to turn into code in some way, right? And not only that, you can't just write equations in an unstructured way. You need to write, there's some constraints depending on how you express this stuff. Like it might say, well, each equation in your system of equations can't have more than one multiplication, or it can't have more than one addition. Or it needs to have exactly this many variables per equation. If that's the case, then that means you need to do a little bit of algebra to finagle your Sudoku system of equations into one that's accepted. So the standard formats for how you can encode your system of equation is called usually one of these three things: rank 1 constraint system, Planck, and AIR. So what are these things? These are just algebraic formats. That's it. Okay, like for example, if you have a system of equations, you can oftentimes present it as a matrix multiplied by a vector, right? That's one way of expressing it. That's exactly what R1CS is, by the way. Whereas Planck and AIR are not exactly like that. They're a little bit more restrictive than that. But these are not difficult to learn, and honestly, an AI could teach it to you, because this is just doing algebra to turn one algebraic form into another. And you should learn this stuff because it's going to be kind of the basis of everything. Now, let me try to explain lookups properly here. So if you, let's say that you're simulating a bitwise operation on a 32-bit word. By default, that's going to create 32 constraints, right? Because you at least need 32 constraints to say this is one bit, another bit, another bit, another bit. And what I say is a bit is really a bit. So whenever there's a lot of very repetitive constraints, that can cause your number of constraints to go up a lot. So lookups are an optimization to handle that. And but honestly, lookups are just algebra again. They're just say, hey, we're going to state these constraints in another way, rather than saying these two words have an XOR relationship with each other. We're just going to create the truth table for XOR and say these variables are in this table somewhere. So I'm not actually going to explicitly create the constraints. Okay, these are used very, very frequently in ZK VMs and very rarely in privacy applications. So depending on your interests, that would affect whether or not you are interested in learning about this. Now, a backend is how you go from algebra to the succinct zero-knowledge proof. Right? I have my system of equations and I have an answer. Now I want to convince you that I know the answer to this system of equations. Well, the algorithm for going from system of equations plus actual variable solutions to something much smaller is what we would call the backend, or it's where you would typically hear of things like Groth16, bulletproofs, zk-starks, GKR, Plonk, which confusingly is also an arithmetization system. That's where those come from. Now this is where like the moon math is. Because it's not trivial to go from a big system of equations and then crunch it down to something small. Obviously, you have to be doing some non-trivial math along the way. This is what we teach in our ZK bootcamp, but you can be an effective auditor without really knowing this. Because most of the time, this is going to be a library, and what you're going to be auditing is are the constraints actually expressing what they are supposed to express. But if you're going to work in the field long term, if this stuff is a black box, then some knowledge is not going to stick to itself. You're going to feel like I'm just memorizing how this works because it just is that way. It's definitely easier to engage with a field if you know what's fundamentally going on. And okay, now that's why these different arithmetizations look the way that they do, because they're actually constrained by what the backend is doing. But these take a while to learn. So in our ZK bootcamp, it takes about 15 weeks for people to code Groth16 from scratch, but these are busy professionals who can only dedicate like 3 hours a week to study. So if you want to learn it a lot faster, you can, but realistically people are busy. So 45 hours, right, in order to learn just one of these backends. But again, if learning is a lifestyle for you, this is something that you break up over time. You don't have to worry about learning it all at once. Okay, frameworks. Like I said, these algorithms here are oftentimes implemented inside of libraries, and the libraries give you a DSL for writing out the math equations, right? Because you wouldn't want to actually write out the math equations we just did in raw Rust, right? That would be kind of painful. Like I have to represent a variable which doesn't have a concrete value yet. So that's all handled for you. These are the most common ones. I absolutely recommend learning Circom first, because bless their hearts, Halo 2 and Plonky 3 don't have the best UX. They've made great contributions to the ecosystem, but they can feel a little bit verbose, so it's kind of hard to get to the core of what you're trying to do. So Circom can be learned in a week if you really grind it out, because it's only one step removed from a math equation. And it's still used. Some people will talk about, oh, Circom's an old language. Like, no, everybody on Solana is using Circom, at least all the Solana people I've talked to. So you definitely want to know it, and it's also much easier to learn Circom first before you learn one of these other Rust DSLs, which are more commonly used. Plonky 3 seems to be the one that's most frequently used in ZK VMs. Succinct used it, and then a lot of people took inspiration from Succinct and used Plonky 3 also. But to learn Plonky 3, you do need to understand how the arithmetization works. Okay, that's it, because it's based off of that. And it would help if you know a lookup argument, because those are used by ZK VMs. Okay, lookup arguments, by the way, fall more under like the arithmetization side of things. It doesn't have much to do with the backend. All right, so that's frameworks. Privacy applications. Now, privacy applications are all basically forks of Tornado Cache, if I'm going to be a little cynical and mean. It's not true. There are some cool innovations, but it's generally you update a Merkle tree and then prove later on that you put something into the Merkle tree and that you're not reusing something. That's fundamentally what's going on. So a lot of people have built Tornado Cache from scratch because it's not hard. The guide, you can just read on our ZK book and you'll have a guide for that. Now, if we're talking about private virtual machines, whew, those are a monster, let me tell you. So that's different, but if you were just talking about we're trying to create a mixer, then actually these are a good place to start because they're not that complex. And actually quite a lot of, I see a lot of this on Solana too. I'm not shilling Solana or anything. I'm just saying that I see a lot of them creating Surcom privacy applications. So check it out, maybe you'll find audits there or something. Okay, so building an actual VM is not difficult. Like I said, you can write this RISC-V or MIPS thing in 1 week if you're motivated. Because an actual VM is really not that hard, right? You loop through opcodes, you put the opcodes into a big switch statement, and then determine what kind of state update you're going to do based off of that. Very simple. Now, the problem is a virtual machine has memory. Any computer has memory, right? So you're saying my RAM at this particular clock cycle had this state. And on the next clock cycle, or after I executed the next opcode, at most one of those cells got updated, right? It's unusual to update a whole bunch of RAM at once. Usually you do, like in EVM terms, it would be like I'm going to mstore or mload, which is only one word at a time. Or you could also do mstore 8, but you get my point, right? So most of the time the constraints in a memory would just be the memory doesn't change. The memory doesn't change, except at 1 or 2 locations. But just saying the memory doesn't change 1 gigabyte of time is already creating a lot of constraint. If you have a gigabyte of memory, then you need 1 billion constraints too, or 8 billion, because you multiply by bits. But you get my point. It's a lot of redundant constraints which just make your system of equations unnecessarily huge. So most of the optimization that goes into VMs is how can I not have that many constraints? Particularly because the allowed state transitions are very small. Only 1 cell can update, and only 1 cell is read. So if you want to get a sense for how those are solved, these are kind of beginner-friendly starting points. ZK Sync is based off of the paper 2 shuffles make a RAM, but this is kind of a development that's everybody uses some variation of that, which is what? Well, the idea is you keep a bunch of tuples, which is when was a certain memory cell accessed and read. And then if you sort it by timestamp or a clock cycle, well, just looking at that sequence of tuples, you should say, well, the value should always be the same up until a write hit. And then anytime it was read, it should always have read that value. So now you actually only care about cells in RAM that were actually engaged with. You don't even need constraints for all the other stuff. So that's kind of ties back to the permutation argument, right? Because you need to sort by timestamp and say, hey, did the state updates over time actually make sense? So VMs are very easy to understand, but the memory consistency model is the hard part. Actually, so in our week-long ZK bootcamp, we actually ended with creating a ZK VM, but so that tells you how rather simple, you can learn in 1 week how to write a VM in Surcom if you really go for it. But the memory consistency model is something that would probably take another week, just to give you the scale of the difficulty. You can build most of the VM very soon, but knowing how this works, it takes a bit of effort. All right, so my general guideline, if you want to engage with the ZK space, you make math learning a lifestyle. It's fundamentally a mathematical field. Knock Rust out. Everyone wants to learn Rust. Rust is fun. Rust is useful. Don't overthink it. Same for cryptography. It takes a little bit longer to learn, but it's a subject all CS not all CS. A lot of CS undergrads take, so there's nothing fundamentally weird about it. VMs. If you take an undergraduate course in a VM, you already know way more than you need to. You just need to know how they work. Like I said, it's a switch statement with a loop. The hard part is the memory consistency model. You can get a big overview of things by reading through the ZK book, but I'm not going to pretend like the ZK book will tell you everything. It's going to get you started, but you actually need to code this stuff up and engage with it if you want to learn it. This would if I was to create like a knowledge graph of everything that I talked about, this is what it would look like. So what do you need to learn before you learn the other thing? But again, I'm not advocating that you need to have 100% mastery of one node before you move on to the next node. But you do need to know some things about one node before you move on to the next node. And then I would advocate that you go back and master the node that you skipped over, especially the math parts. Anything that I should explain here? I think this should be mostly self-explanatory. Arithmetization schemes are very simple algebra, but they're oftentimes expressed in abstract algebra terms. Can you guys see my mouse? Yeah, okay. Most frameworks, except Circom, are written in Rust, so it's helpful to know Rust before that. If you're going to make a ZK VM, obviously you want to know how the VM works. And lookups are something you should learn after arithmetization schemes. That should be mostly self-explanatory. And backends, as you can see, you can do a lot of ZK without knowing how the proofs actually happened. But knowing how the backend works will give you a framework for understanding everything. So I wouldn't advocate, like, oh, I need to master Groth16 and Planck and bulletproofs and stuff like that before I learn all of this other stuff. No. Backends are a challenging subject, and they're best learned slowly, which is how we teach them. 3 hours a week for 15 weeks. Don't be in a hurry. Okay. And then when you get into the ZK world, inevitably you start hearing about all of this. If I don't know how garbled circuits work, I barely know anything about it. You don't expect yourself to be even intermediate at a lot of things, especially not in a short time period. But if it's your lifestyle to be learning something new every day, especially the foundational things which make it easier to learn the more advanced ones, then it comes with time. A lot of people put pressure on themselves, like, man, in 6 months I need to be here. A lot of things are basically impossible in 6 months, but if you look at it on a 6-year time frame, well, then pretty much everything seems easy. So try to think in those terms. Not seems easy, it is easy. Okay, and the other thing about ZK, this is something, an anti-pattern that I want to warn you about, is it's easy to read something and like, oh yeah, I understood that. Great, I feel good about myself. I can talk about this at parties. Or not at parties, at like conferences. And you can read some articles and then like actually sound like you know what you're talking about, which is fine, if you just want to shoot the breeze with people and talk about interesting subjects. But if you want to do something economically valuable, you need to be able to do more than just talk about it. So with the ZK book, what I really, really recommend is when you see the math, we've made the math intentionally easy to translate into code. So one way to really engage your brain with that is you should actually code it. The bulletproof section of the math book actually has exercises for you to code the bulletproof from scratch incrementally, and that's free on GitHub. So you should actually do those things. I know it's painful, but I already gave you my speech earlier about your brain tricking you out of doing painful things, so don't fall for that trap. If you need anything, that's my email. So that will wrap up the talk. Oh, and come to our live smart contract hacking event tomorrow if you aren't already signed up. Yeah.
Thank you. So, like, there is like a kind of, you want to achieve something, so you learn this to achieve this. So, like, about like 2 years ago, there was a team called Chainlight, and there was a ZK contest.
Yep.
So these are experts. And that was some young guy. I don't know if he's a guy or a girl. So they said they learned Rust and ZK in like 3 days. And they like flushed out the most bugs. And they won the contest. So like, you are saying like you need to, like, and I think ZK Sinclair called him to like give them a re-audit on their code base. So like, you are saying it might take you time to learn all this. But also, we've seen it's possible to also, like, for auditing, I heard Ubron talking about, like, if you know how the constraint works, maybe you have to prove that it's 1, then maybe the person brings -1 and he passes the... I don't understand this. I kind of know, that kind of thing. So, like, the whole gap is, like, so long, especially when you want to enter bounties and want to enter box. So like, how do you like balance all these?
Okay, so if you're talking about Chainlight, one thing I can guarantee is that they have all of this other stuff absolutely mastered to a very, very high degree. So if you have the prerequisite knowledge just really, really down, then learning something right in front of it is very easy. So I've seen people learn ZK part-time in about 5 weeks. So Philology, actually, took our...
The guy who beat them
Mhm.
learned all this with no knowledge. I just think he won some Olympiad in mathematics.
Oh, you're okay. I think I know who you're talking about. But the person
Guys,
the person you're talking about is an extremely strong math background. So if you're coming, I'm coming into this assuming that you guys aren't math majors or competed in math competitions. If you're coming from that background, they have a very different story to tell. So how do I say this nicely? If you come from a competitive math research background, a lot of what we do is child's play. So that's just a fact. So that's how they're able to do that. Yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
Mhm.
So about the auditing of CK circuits,
Yep.
and more specifically in using CK VMs, what is the level of trust that I have on the compiler to actually translate all the constraints that I set up in the Rust code into the memory consistency?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
There have been known bugs found in Aztec, at least for that, and I think ZK. What's it? Anyway, those happen. These are not mature compilers, right? So even if these very smart, well-resourced people do it, they're working on something new, and it's just part of the nature of the beast that there's going to be problems with a compiler. So could it be if the question behind the question is it a fruitful area of research to really get into ZK compilers and find bugs there? I suspect so if you have the background knowledge to handle it. It's a very niche field, and there's pros and cons to getting into something that niche. So, but if it engages you, then I think that there could be opportunity there. But I don't have deep familiarity with the compilation part of that stuff. But it's complicated. Very few people know how to do it, and bugs have happened.
Yeah, one of the challenges I have, or I had when I started with ZK, is if you learn something like a certain topic, it takes so long because I have a full-time job. So learning everything, even if it's a lifestyle, if I come to a point where I learn arithmetization and then I learn R1CS, it's very hard to find applications that need auditing for that stuff. Like you have to actually find the clients. In my case, as a security researchers, the market is not flooded with R1CS implementation that you have to audit. So after a couple of months, if you ask me now, and I think I'm one of your first students, and for everyone here, like if you're interested in the course, it's definitely worth the money. I was skeptical at the beginning, but he's really a great teacher. I'm not trying to show the project. I'm not paid by him to say it. But I just want to say like it's really worth the money. But it's been a year ago, and if you tell me now, hey, can you audit my R1CS project? I would say I'll have to take like 2 months again to go back to the content and learn it again. I'll probably learn it faster than the first time, but if I have to learn something else like FHE or something, I'll have to learn again for 2 or 3 months again to be able to audit something. But auditing something is not like building something. Building, maybe you don't have to understand everything like very specifically because you're just building it, and if it works, it works, and then the auditors take care of it. But the auditors have to understand everything 100%, and this is the challenge I face the most with ZK.
I think that's why I talk about the lifestyle thing, because it's a big field, and if you don't have the luxury of studying it full time, it creates a challenge. And I think there's no fundamental way to solve that kind of a problem. well, at least I remember that when I was teaching you. So we didn't focus on like the constraint part of the stuff in the course. That was focused on the back end. So I think if you're concentrated on the arithmetization part, that's probably something where you're more likely to get audits. But if you're as an auditor, you're really trying to get to the place of, I know this better than the devs do, right? And fundamentally, that it takes a lot of work to get to that point, right? So I would say ZK sometimes feels like learning how to code all over again, because we're using a totally different environment, we're using a totally different language, and we're using a totally different programming language. Or even not just programming language, like expressing things as polynomials, right? Is a weird way to express computation. And a lot of people have a hard time even just using normal variables and for loops. So you're kind of going through that again. What I would say, if you want to get into auditing as fast as possible, where most of the audits happen, the most fruitful thing to focus on would be this over here, which is just talking about how do we use math to design our application, right? So CIRCOM is one step removed from math. So that's what the people at Rare Week were studying, and they were able to participate in the Succinct and Brevis coprocessor contest afterwards. Now, were there a lot of knowledge gaps? Right, you have to learn a new framework because those are written in Plonky 3. But the actual focus of, hey, are there missing constraints? That's probably the easiest thing to jump into because you can reuse the attacker's mindset. But at the same time, in the long term, I suspect it's also going to be the one that gets most commoditized because it's also easy to get into, relatively. And people are going to build better and better tooling around detecting missing constraints. And that's something that a computer will tend to be good at. That's not true right now, but it will be true later. The good news is you did the hard part already. This part's a lot easier. People, if you're really focused, you can get through this in a couple of weeks, especially with the background knowledge that you have.
More than a question is like a comment with the question before, is that you don't become an auditor and that's all. Like you start to learn as long as you keep auditing. For example, when when it arrives a new concept or something like that, and you do an audit on that, you keep going. For example, a technique that I use is that I keep a list of things that I previously found to use in another audit, and that audit will give me more items to check. So what I am trying to say is that auditing something, you just don't say like I am an auditor and I learned everything 100%. That doesn't happen, I think.
Yep. And also in terms of timescale, something I would say, like the people that I've seen go from not knowing anything about ZK to working at a firm was 6 months of part-time but bordering on full-time study. So that just in terms of the optimistic time to get to that point that's the amount of effort that I've seen from them. And these people didn't have a full-time job or didn't have a very demanding one. So that's if you just want some sense of scale about what you're trying to do, that's what I've seen in the faster case. But again, everyone's case is different, right? You might already know someone at the firm. You might have happened to study something that's particularly relevant. So, take that as with wide error bars. All right, I think that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming here, and thanks everybody for attending. Thanks the volunteers. Thanks the recorder. We are actually continuing tomorrow and the day after in the main event. If you have problem getting tickets, let us know. We have a full content there. There's workshop. There are 2 tracks, so please enjoy, and there are many other events, so please enjoy and thank you.